So I now want to start by asking, as I said, some of the questions about how things work at the beginning of an investigation and getting to a resolution. I wanted to start with the very first. So your company has an incident, a violation, and the very first question is, should you voluntarily self-disclose this or not? And the Justice Department has been quite clear that if you voluntarily self-disclose, a whole lot of other stuff can get easier, even if you have some very unflattering circumstances behind it. But, what should we think about voluntary self-disclosure? I'm sort of the mind that, well, of course a company's going to do that now because they'll be able to, avoid a lot of headache. But am I wrong in that way? What would you say?
Yes, I would challenge that. I would challenge the notion that self-disclosure is always the right move. And I would counsel folks to resist the automatic jump from finding misconduct to self-disclosure, because I think it's important before you try to even convince your stakeholders to convince yourself first. What is the evidence and what is the legal analysis of the cost and benefits of self-disclosure? Do your homework. What do you know about the misconduct at this point? What evidence do you have? What evidence would the government be able to get on its own if you do not self-disclose? Because I certainly do know companies, not a small number of companies that have chosen not to self-disclose, and I will say nothing has happened to them, and many of them the statute of limitation has run. I'm not saying it's the right thing or the wrong thing to make that move. All I'm saying is I think I would resist any automatic conclusion that you always go from here to here. But I think I would counsel people to give it much more rigorous thought and analysis than I often hear.
Andrew, what would you respond to on that, given the 18 months, I think, at Albemarle? What's your reaction to that, and how much of what Hui said contributed to that time period?
I completely agree with Hui here. So, you have to be careful that you don't come across as being the morality police here of, thou must self-disclose, because that won't be well received by management or the board. As chief compliance officer, I saw my role in conjunction with general counsel and outside counsel in ensuring that management and the board are in possession of the full facts and the pros and cons of self-disclosure. So the decision for Albemarle to self-report was taken before I joined, so I can't really comment on the specifics for that, and also just from a confidentiality point of view. But I will say that the decision to self-report back in 2017, 2018 is very different perhaps to one that's being made now. Back then, even the fact of making a self-report was still pretty new, and the concepts of timely disclosure were really only beginning to crystallize. It's great to see the credit that Albemarle got, but the whole process from start of the investigation through to the resolution took nearly 7 years, countless management and board meetings, significant outside advisor spend, the reputational damage, and a follow-on shareholder derivative lawsuit. So it's a pretty significant decision, very significant decision. But that said, as I said, the decision to self-report now in 2024 is quite different. You have to go in with your eyes wide open. So where you start with an investigation is not necessarily where you'll end up. And there'll be various aspects of the way in which your investigation was conducted that will be judged by the prevailing standard at the time of resolution, not when you reported. So that could be positive and negative. So on the negative side, it's been well documented, Albemarle did not get the credit for timely disclosure. But then back in 2018, 2019, when it was making decisions about clawing back bonuses of executives, it was doing that in line with its core values. It wasn't doing that because of a clawback policy, because there was no such clawback policy or credit against the penalty at that time. And so there are many, many factors, I think, that go into it. And so really trying to kind of get the facts around the actual investigation, what as Hui was saying earlier, and then all of those additional factors is key.
Ken, give me your take on this as well, and including what are the expectations for speedy self-disclosure? Because Andrew raises a very good, valid point that the company needs to establish some basic understanding. But I can remember there was a case, I don't remember the specific company, but they had placed an appointment with the DOJ basically to self-disclose, but between when they called to make the appointment and the actual appointment, it got out in the press. And then that kind of jeopardized voluntary self-disclosure. And I sometimes wonder if boards can get lost in the head games of how quickly should we say this, and what if we don't really know enough to give much information? Like, how does the DOJ think that through?
Just on the first point, I think Andrew and Hui have kind of articulated exactly where I am related to this battle around voluntary self-disclosure or not. We represent a lot of companies, and it's interesting to see that there's a lot of managers, a lot of boards who are reflexive in their position as to voluntary self-disclosure. That is, they come into the initial days of confronting misconduct, and some boards we are absolutely self-disclosing, and then others we will never self-disclose. And so the real battle oftentimes is getting these companies to engage in the more nuanced, rigorous process of going through the facts and circumstances, evaluating the strengths and weaknesses that come with voluntary self-disclosure. I mean, look, the department's done a great job of messaging here. There are companies out there that think they're under an obligation, in fact, to voluntarily self-disclose based on the way that this is sometimes framed when that is not, oftentimes that is not the case at all. To your second point about reasonably prompt self-disclosure, I think this is an area where I think the department could do itself and do the corporate landscape some real benefit by increasing the amount of detail that they offer in their resolutions around this particular issue. There was one case recently where the department specifically outlined the fact that they were not considering self-disclosure as being reasonably prompt. And my recollection was that it was almost 18 months or so after the time when the company learned of the underlying misconduct. They had engaged in an internal investigation with outside counsel involved. And it was almost 9 months after outside counsel had determined that there were credible findings of misconduct before they walked that information into the department. That was evaluated as not being reasonably prompt. So we have some, we have that decision and maybe a less than a handful of others that kind of clearly offer some detail around the department's thinking around that space. But that is a challenge. That's an opportunity for improvement, in my view, around the department's transparency in this space.